Despite not owning a single vehicle, Uber is regarded as the world's largest taxi company, dominating over 70% of the global market share. But behind this lofty achievement and robust business structure is a long list of gross scandals. Join us in today's video as we explore the industry story of Uber, featuring deception, sexual harassment, discrimination, and high-level corruption. Like most successful businesses, the idea for Uber was generated by a real intent to solve a problem. It all started on a cold night in Paris back in 2008, when Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp stood for hours waiting for their cab to arrive. But it never did. They figured that it had to be better to efficiently run a taxi business and avoid the poor service that customers are often subjected to. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait too long to find a solution. During a James Bond movie, they watched a scene where Bond tracked a car using his mobile device, and this served as inspiration for their first app called UberCab. UberCab was introduced as the perfect solution to all the existing problems in the taxi industry. With this app, passengers can now order rides and track the location of the cab to know exactly how long they have to wait before it arrives. Perhaps more importantly, Uber was offering cars with better interiors and chilled bottles of water as a compliment. Lastly, the Uber service came with a seamless payment feature that allowed customers to pay for their ride using their debit card. In the beginning, Uber was launched as a luxury cab and limousine cruise service that gave customers the James Bond experience. So, in the early days, ordering an Uber was synonymous with wealth. The business ran seamlessly for a couple of months until the transportation agency stormed Uber's office in October to inform them that their operation violated the law. It wasn't about the drivers. Uber's business model was such that they didn't own any of the vehicles. Instead, they simply partnered with professional drivers who already had cars. This allowed them to cut costs while earning a decent commission. But this model created legal problems for the company, which required them to pay up to $5,000 in fines. In addition, the authorities threatened the Uber team with up to a 90-day jail term for every day they remained in service. But just when tensions were about to hit the roof, the company's co-founder, Travis Kalanick, came up with an evil genius idea to remove cab from the company's name. He announced emphatically that they were no longer a taxi company but a technology company. Consequently, the rules that created the illegality no longer applied to the company. Travis would continue to craft evil ideas that would save the company billions of dollars in potential expenses. For instance, they declared the drivers as partners, which meant that they didn't have to give them extra employment rights and benefits. Uber knew that if the app got big enough to entice more people, it would be difficult for the government to ban it due to the public backlash that would follow. But rather than market the app to new customers, Uber struck a deal with TNT for a bulk order of iPhones that were already pre-programmed with the company's software. They also announced cash rewards for drivers who complete a certain number of trips per week. Similarly, they introduced different bonuses for passengers, including free rides and discount coupons. It meant they had to forfeit some of their profits in the early stages, but in the long run, the strategy worked like magic, as it compelled customers to use the service over and over again. With time, they expanded into other cities, and the traditional taxi service providers could no longer keep up with the competition. The authorities were concerned for sure, as they really couldn't tell what Uber was doing differently to give them this sort of advantage. Also, the legality of the business was constantly questioned, but every time they opened an inquiry into the company's operation, they were met with a long list of petitions and protests, most of which were non-organic. But things got really serious in 2012 when the taxi company introduced a new service called UberX, allowing just about anyone to offer taxi services on its platform. This created even more legal issues. But seeing how unresponsive the company had been to the earlier threat, authorities decided to threaten the drivers themselves. They promised to confiscate any vehicle registered with Uber. But the company was prepared. Like a digital pirate who sailed the high seas of the transportation industry, Uber was willing to do whatever it took to stay ahead of the curve, and this included breaking the law. They used different illegal and ingenious tactics to avoid being caught by the authorities. One of the most prominent ones was sending out prompt notices on the app informing drivers that any fines or fees incurred while driving for Uber would be fully reimbursed. But they also knew that the authorities could disguise themselves as customers and trick drivers. So they developed a secret system called Grayball, which prevented law enforcement agents and regulators from using the Uber app. Greyball worked by detecting when someone from a government agency tried to sign up for the app. Once a government official is identified, they will be greyballed. In other words, they were restricted from seeing available cars on the Uber app. And this proved to be quite effective because it allowed Uber to operate in cities where it was not legally allowed to do so. For example, the company was banned from operating in London in 2017. However, it was able to continue operating in the city thanks to the greyball mechanism. At this point, they felt like they could do whatever they wanted and no one could stop them. They were willing to break the rules, bend the truth, and even spy on their enemies. Eventually, the greyball scheme failed. But for the umpteenth time, Uber was one step ahead of the law enforcement agencies. Out of their massive bag of profits, the evil geniuses behind the platform spent hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying government officials to legalize their services. In places where this couldn't work, they deployed cheap blackmail. Once Uber had a foothold in a city, they would often use their power to bully and intimidate local authorities. They would threaten to pull out of the city if their demands were not met. This put local governments in a difficult position. They didn't want to lose the tax revenue that Uber brought in, but they also didn't want to be seen as being soft on a company that was breaking the law. While all this was going on, a ride-sharing war kicked in between Uber and Lyft. Both companies were locked in a fierce battle for a significant portion of the market. Expectedly, Uber was the first mover, but Lyft was quickly catching up, especially because it had a more friendly and welcoming image. Also, it was seen as being more affordable than Uber. But in the end, Uber was able to outmaneuver Lyft and become the dominant ride-sharing app in the world. However, this victory came at a cost. The company's aggressive tactics alienated many people and it developed a reputation for being unethical. Uber is still struggling to deal with some of this bad reputation even today. Eventually, the mental and emotional strain forced some drivers to commit suicide. The controversies around Uber continued to build up, but things reached booking points in 2014 when a vile Uber driver raped a 26-year-old woman who had slept off in his car. Somehow, she was able to capture the number plates of the car and the culprit was arrested. But critically, the negative PR had spread so much that the company couldn't contain it. Most critics blamed the security issues on the low entry level, which allowed anyone to drive for the company. But every time a complaint was made, Uber turned a blind eye to it. Instead, they tried to skirt the law and avoid sanctions. Even worse, reports emerged of how Uber manipulated its data and privacy settings, so it could track the location of users even after their ride was done. The company reportedly monitored the movements and data of some special individuals, including celebrities. A few years later, the company was caught in a massive data breach scandal that exposed the personal data of 57 million customers. Travis and his team had to pay top dollar to hackers to fix this issue. They also paid around $28.5 million to settle the lawsuit that resulted from this breach. But rather than learn from his mistakes, Travis continued with his unhealthy and aggressive marketing schemes. For him, every time Uber entered a new market, it was either all or nothing. Travis promoted an Uber versus the world mentality within the company, which eventually created a hostile working environment. Staff often worked overtime at the office and even at home. Expectedly, most of them suffered severe burnout from the mental and physical stress, but every time they had an appointment with a therapist, their commitments at work meant they couldn't meet up. Travis leveraged the trust and dedication of his workers and the fat purse available to him to drive Uber's growth. They hosted extravagant parties, including one in Las Vegas that cost $25 million. Beyoncé and Jay-Z were in attendance, and it just so happened that they also became investors in the company. Well, that was what we were told, but in reality, Travis offered them Uber stocks as a reward for attending the party. Most employees didn't mind though. I mean, getting a free ticket to watch some of the world's biggest artists perform live in Las Vegas is perhaps the biggest level of enticement any 9-to-5 worker can ask for. And you can imagine that most of them were ecstatic to see Beyoncé and Jay-Z entertain them. But events like these only cover the cracks and often don't tell the real story of what's going on in a massive business organization like Uber. In no time, the company was back swimming in the gloomy waters of scandal. This time, it was Susan Fowler, one of the company's former employees, who revealed how she was sexually harassed by her boss during her time at Uber. To make things worse, despite reporting to the official channels, the company's HR department dimmed the allegations. As soon as the story made it to the mainstream media, other employees and past employees who had experienced the same ordeal began to speak up. In fairness to him, Travis ordered an independent investigation into the allegations. Uber also held a company-wide meeting to discuss possible solutions to the problems. But as soon as they seemed to be solving one issue, another scandal emerged out of nowhere. At this point, Travis was beginning to feel the heat. The hostile environment he had created was beginning to eat him up as well. According to reports, he broke down in tears at some point, blaming himself for the internal chaos at the company. This culminated in a period of personal grief for him after his parents had a tragic boat accident that killed his mum and left his dad hospitalized. So in June 2017, Travis decided to take some time off with the promise that he'd return as a better leader and human. Unknown to him, he'd never returned to his position. Barely 1 month into his leave of absence, Travis was forced to resign as Uber CEO by some of the company's biggest shareholders. As expected, he felt betrayed because without his input, Uber probably wouldn't be what it is today. But having built an unfriendly work environment, his ride at the company had to come to an end. After his exit, the company has tried to fix most of the problems by mending the relationship with drivers and improving the work environment. But expectedly, some of the underlying issues still exist and will take a bit more time to be resolved. What do you make of this barrage of scandals that has plagued Uber over the years? Was it right to make Travis take the fall? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more exciting stories from the most influential people and top brands.